The year was 1976, and the air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction crackled with a dangerous kind of optimism. It was the smell of money, fresh-turned earth, and the sweet, cloying scent of diesel exhaust from tractors idling in neat rows. For most men here, that smell was the perfume of progress. For Thomas Miller, it smelled like a trap. He stood near the back, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, a faded pioneer seed corn cap pulled low over his brow. He wasn't here for the main event. He was a scavenger, a vulture circling the edges, waiting for the small, forgotten things. His eyes scanned past the gleaming giants, lined up in the front row. The brand-new International Harvester 1466, with its dual rear wheels and its paint so red it hurt the eyes. The massive John Deere 7700 Combine with a price tag that could buy a whole house in town. Tom's gaze settled on a dusty pallet of hydraulic parts, a jumble of greasy cylinders, pumps and hoses, stripped from tractors, long since sent to the scrapyard. Somewhere in that pile, he hoped, was a main hydraulic pump that could be rebuilt for his John Deere 4020. His 4020, a 1968 model. He'd bought it used 10 years ago, and it had been his main horse ever since. Its green paint was faded to the color of a late summer leaf. The fenders were dented, and the seat was patched with duct tape. But Tom knew every bolt and every grease zerk on it. He knew the particular whine it made when the hydraulic fluid was a quart low, the way the six-cylinder diesel engine coughed to life on a cold November morning, and the satisfying thud of the synchro-range transmission dropping into 8th gear. It was paid for. That was the most important part. Everything on his 320 acres was paid for, from the old Farmall M he used for planting to the rusty Gleaner E combine that looked like a museum piece but still brought the crop in every fall. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," a voice boomed behind him. "Don't tell me you're finally going to trade in that green relic for some real horsepower, Tom." Tom didn't have to turn around. He knew that voice. Richard Peterson. Rich had inherited the farm next door around the same time Tom had. But that's where the similarities ended. Rich was all flash and ambition, a man who saw the bank as a partner and debt as a tool. He strode up beside Tom, smelling of new truck air freshener and expensive aftershave. He was wearing a clean, pressed western shirt and polished boots, looking more like a cattle baron than a man who worked the soil. "Just lookin', Rich," Tom said, his voice low and flat. He kept his eyes on the pallet of parts. "Looking at junk," Rich scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at the pile. "They got a brand new 1466 over there, turbocharged, 145 horsepower at the PTO, cab, air conditioning, radio. I'm thinking of picking it up for my fall tillage. The 1066 is a good tractor, but a man's got to keep up." Tom grunted. Rich's 1066 was barely 3 years old. My 4020 still pulls a 5-bottom plow just fine. Rich laughed, a loud, grating sound that drew the attention of a few other farmers nearby. "A 5-bottom? Tom, it's 1976. We're not scratching in the dirt like our granddads anymore. I'm pulling a 7-bottom mold board with the 1066, and I'm thinking of moving up to a chisel plow. More acres, less time. That's the name of the game." He clapped Tom on the shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to seem friendly, but felt more like a judgment. "You got to spend money to make money, my friend. The bank in town is handing out loans at 7%. 7! It's practically free money with corn at $3 a bushel." The auctioneer's rhythmic chant started up, drawing the crowd's focus to the front row. They were starting with the big iron first. Rich gave Tom another condescending pat. "You stay here and pick through the bone pile. I'm going to go buy a tractor." Tom watched him go, a knot tightening in his gut. He hated that Rich was probably right, at least in the eyes of everyone else here. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly talking about expansion, buying up every parcel of land that came for sale, leveraging their rising land values to buy bigger and better equipment. They saw Tom, with his old, paid-for machinery and his refusal to take on debt, as a relic. A man stuck in the past, too scared or too stubborn to get with the times. They called him cheap. They called him a fool. He heard the whispers at the co-op, at the diner in town. Old Man Miller's boy is going to lose that farm. Can't keep up this way. He waited for an hour while the big-ticket items sold for astronomical prices. Rich, true to his word, got into a bidding war for the 1466 and won it, his hand shooting up with a confident flick of the wrist for the final bid. A representative from the bank was right there with a clipboard, and Rich signed the papers with a flourish, a wide grin splitting his face. Finally, the auctioneer got to the smaller stuff. When the pallet of hydraulic parts came up, the crowd thinned. Most weren't interested in turning wrenches when they could just write a check. The bidding started at $20. Tom let a couple of other scrap-yard pickers go back and forth before he raised his hand. $30, he said, his voice clear and steady. The other bidder hesitated, then shook his head. Sold, the auctioneer barked, pointing his gavel at Tom. To the man in the pioneer cap for $30. Tom paid the clerk in cash and backed his old Ford F-250 up to the pallet. The truck, a 67 with a straight-six engine and a 4-speed manual, was as no-nonsense as he was. It had rust in the wheel wells and a permanent layer of dust on the dash. But it always started, as he and one of the auction yard workers grunted to slide a heavy pump onto the tailgate. Rich Peterson pulled up alongside him in his brand-new GMC High Sierra, the 1406, already loaded on a trailer behind it. The chrome on the truck's grille gleamed so brightly it was hard to look at. Rich leaned out the window, the smell of the new vinyl interior wafting out. $30, huh, Tom? That's what your whole operation is worth? A pile of junk? He shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. You know, my daddy always said there's a difference between being frugal and being cheap. Frugal is a virtue. Cheap will put you in the ground. He didn't wait for a reply. He just put the truck in gear and pulled away, leaving Tom standing in a cloud of dust and the faint smell of his own failure. Tom looked at the greasy, 200-pound iron pump sitting on his tailgate, then at the tail lights of Rich's new rig disappearing down the road. For a single, fleeting moment, he wondered if they were all right. He wondered if he was the fool. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you folks listening to this story, have you ever known a man like Tom? A man who'd rather spend a week with a wrench and a grease gun than a single afternoon with a banker? A man who believed that the only good iron was iron you owned outright? Or maybe you knew a fella like Rich, who saw the world changing and believed that you had to borrow big and bet big just to stay in the game. Let me know down in the comments which one of them you think had it right, back there in the summer of '76, because the answer wasn't as simple as it looked. The next morning, the sun rose over the Miller farm, casting long shadows from the oak trees that lined the lane. Tom was already in his machine shed, the door rolled open to let in the pale light. The shed wasn't a modern pole barn like the one Rich had just built. It was an old hip-roofed barn his grandfather had raised, with massive hand-hewn beams and the lingering scent of hay and decades of hard work soaked into the wood. His John Deere 4020 sat in the center of the floor, its side panel removed, exposing the complex guts of its hydraulic system. The air was thick with the smell of penetrating oil and the metallic tang of old iron. On the workbench, the pump he'd bought at the auction was completely disassembled. its parts laid out in a neat row on a clean cloth. It was a mess. The seals were shot, one of the main bearings was scored, and there was a fine grit of metal shavings in the bottom of the housing. To anyone else, it would have been scrap metal. To Tom, it was a puzzle. He spent the entire day in that shed. It was a slow, methodical process that couldn't be rushed. He drained the 16 gallons of high-guard fluid from the tractor's transmission case, the amber liquid smelling faintly sweet and burnt. He wrestled the old failed pump out of the tractor's belly, a job that required a floor jack, a pry bar, and a string of curses his wife, Mary, wouldn't have appreciated hearing. It was heavy, awkward work, his knuckles getting scraped and his muscles aching with the strain. With the old pump out, he turned his full attention to the $30 auction prize. He used a wire brush and a can of brake cleaner to scrub every gear, every valve, every inch of the housing until it was spotless. He drove into town to the John Deere dealership, not for a new pump. That would have been over $800, but for a rebuild kit. A small cardboard box containing a handful of O-rings, gaskets, and 2 new bearings. It cost him $42.50. The parts man, a young kid who didn't know Tom from Adam, tried to sell him on a new tractor. "We've got great financing right now, Mr. Miller. You could be in a new 4430 by this afternoon." Tom just shook his head, paid for his parts in cash, and left. Back in the shed, he began the delicate surgery. He used a brass drift and a hammer to gently tap the new bearing races into place. He meticulously replaced every seal, coating each one with a thin film of clean hydraulic fluid. He checked the tolerances between the gears with a feeler gauge, making sure everything was within the 1,000th of an inch specifications listed in his worn, grease-stained service manual. It was quiet, focused work, the only sounds the scrape of metal, the click of a ratchet, and the distant call of a mourning dove. This was his sanctuary. Out here, with his hands covered in grease and his mind occupied with the logic of machinery, the whispers of the outside world faded away. He wasn't cheap, Tom Miller. He was a mechanic, a farmer, a man in control of his own destiny. By late afternoon, the pump was reassembled. It looked almost new. He bolted it back into the tractor, a process even more awkward than taking the old one out, his arms straining to hold the heavy unit in place while he threaded the bolts by feel. He reconnected the high-pressure lines, tightening the fittings until they were snug, but not stripped. Finally, he funneled the fresh, clean high-guard fluid back into the transmission. The moment of truth. He climbed onto the familiar cracked seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The 4020's big 6-cylinder diesel turned over twice, then roared to life, filling the barn with its deep, reassuring rumble. He let it warm up for a few minutes, his eyes fixed on the oil pressure gauge. Then he reached down and pulled the hydraulic lever to lift the 3-point hitch. For a second, nothing happened. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Had he missed something? Put a seal in backwards? Then, with a soft, hydraulic hiss, the heavy lift arms rose smoothly and powerfully, without the shudder and groan they'd had for the past year. He cycled them up and down. Perfect. He engaged the PTO. It spun without a single vibration. He had done it. For a total of $72.50 and 2 days of his own sweat and skinned knuckles, he had a hydraulic system that was as good as new. A smile, a rare thing for Tom, touched the corners of his mouth. That fall, the contrast between his farm and Rich Peterson's was starker than ever. While Tom nursed his old Gleaner E through the soybean harvest, stopping every few hours to grease a bearing or tighten a belt, Rich's brand new 7700 combine chewed through his fields at twice the speed. From his own tractor cab, Tom could see Rich's operation running late into the night, a fleet of new equipment working under bright halogen lights, looking like a professional army laying siege to the land. Tom finished his harvest a week after Rich did, his yields just as good, but his pace was a subject of mockery down at the grain elevator. "Took you long enough, Tom," the elevator manager said with a smirk, as Tom weighed in his last load. Rich Peterson was done, and had his fall tillage finished before you were halfway through your beans. Tom just nodded and handed over his scale ticket. He didn't bother explaining that while Rich was making payments on a $100,000 combine, his own harvest had cost him nothing more than fuel, a few spare parts, and his own time. While Rich was paying interest, Tom was putting cash in the bank. But nobody saw that. They only saw the old slow machine versus the new, fast one. And in 1976, speed was everything. The next couple of years felt like a golden age for American agriculture, and it only proved Rich Peterson right in everyone's eyes. The optimism Tom had felt at the auction wasn't a fluke, it was the new reality. Grain prices, fueled by huge sales to the Soviet Union, stayed high. Farmland values in their corner of Iowa skyrocketed, doubling and then nearly tripling in value between 1976 and 1979. The government was practically begging farmers to produce more, to plant fence row to fence row, and the banks were more than happy to provide the money to do it. For a man like Rich Peterson, it was paradise. His gamble was paying off in spades. The rising value of his original acreage gave him immense collateral, and he leveraged it to the hilt. In 1978, when the 160-acre farm on his western border came up for sale, Rich bought it without blinking, taking on another massive mortgage. To work the new ground, he traded his 2-year-old 1496 for a brand-new International Harvester 3588, one of the new 2+2 articulated tractors that looked like something from the future. He bought a bigger planter, a 12-row instead of his 8-row. He built a new grain, drying and storage system on his property, a towering silver monument to his success that was visible for miles around. Rich became the local hero, the man everyone pointed to as the model of the modern farmer. He was featured in the county newspaper, standing in front of his new tractor, talking about yields and expansion and the bright future of farming. He and his wife were regulars at the country club. She drove a new Chrysler station wagon with fake wood paneling on the sides. They took a vacation to Hawaii. To the rest of the community, Rich Peterson was a visionary, a man who had seized the moment. And Tom Miller was the man who had missed it. He stuck to his guns. The good years were a relief, but not a revolution for him. The extra income from the high commodity prices didn't go into new iron or more land. It went into the bank. He paid off the last small operating note he had from the spring of '76 and never took out another. He built up a cash reserve, a cushion his father had always called a rainy day fund. Though his father had been thinking of a bad harvest, not a financial storm, he kept his 320 acres and he kept his old machinery running. The pressure to change, to conform, was immense. It came from all sides: the seed dealer, the equipment salesman, even his own relatives. His brother-in-law, a car salesman from Des Moines, cornered him at Thanksgiving. "Tom, for God's sake, you're sitting on a gold mine. Your land is worth a fortune. Borrow against it. Live a little. Mary deserves a new kitchen, a new car. You're working yourself to death for what? To be the most solvent man in the cemetery?" Mary never complained, but Tom saw the way she looked at the Petersons' new house, the way she avoided talking to Rich's wife at church. He knew this was hard on her. He was making them pariahs, the county curiosities, the man who was too cheap to succeed. The whispers at the diner weren't mocking anymore. They were laced with pity. Poor Tom Miller. He just doesn't get it. Could have been a millionaire by now. Instead, he's patching tires on a grain truck that's old enough to vote. One sweltering afternoon in the summer of 1979, Tom was under that very grain truck, a 1960 Chevy C60, replacing a leaking wheel cylinder. He was covered in grease and sweat, the gravel of his driveway digging into his back. Rich Peterson pulled into the lane, not in his pickup, but on a brand new John Deere 4840. The tractor was enormous, a beast of over 180 horsepower, with a soundproofed sound guard cab that was probably air-conditioned to a cool 70 degrees. Rich idled the big diesel down and leaned out of the cab door. "Still playing with your toys, Tom?" he called down, a smirk on his face. Tom slid out from under the truck and slowly got to his feet, wiping his hands on an already blackened rag. "It'll be ready for harvest, Rich." "I'm sure it will," Rich said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Listen, the real reason I stopped by, I just closed on the old Johnson place, the 80 acres that borders your north field." Tom felt his stomach clench. That was some of the best black dirt in the county. "Figured I'd let you know," Rich continued, enjoying the moment, "since you weren't going to make a move on it. That gives me just over 1,000 acres now. Gonna need to hire a full-time man next spring." He patted the side of his magnificent new tractor. Had to get this thing just to handle all the tillage. Cost a fortune, but you gotta have the right tools for the job. He looked at Tom, at his sweat-stained shirt and the ancient truck behind him. The smirk softened into that same look of pity Tom had seen at the auction 3 years earlier. "You know, Tom, it's not too late. Prices are still high. The bank would still give you a loan. You could get a piece of the pie." "I've got all the pie I need, Rich," Tom said quietly. Rich just shook his head and laughed. "Suit yourself. Don't come crying to me when you get left behind for good." He pushed a lever, and the big John Deere rumbled away, leaving Tom standing alone in his driveway, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table long after Mary had gone to bed, a single dim light on over the sink. He had his account book open. The columns were neat, the numbers all written in black ink. No red, no debts. A healthy, if not spectacular, balance in his savings account at the local bank. By every measure his father had taught him, he was a success. He was a free man. He owned his land, his home, his machines. He owed nothing to anyone. So why did he feel like a failure? Why did Rich Peterson's words echo in his head? He got up and walked to the back door, looking out across his fields, dark and silent under a canopy of stars. Far off to the west, on the land that used to be the Johnson place, he saw a set of bright lights moving back and forth, cutting across the horizon. It was Rich in his new 4840, chisel ploughing his new ground, working late into the night. The sound of the powerful diesel engine carried faintly on the night air. Tom stood there for a long time, listening. He thought about the news he'd heard on the radio that evening. Something about the Federal Reserve, about a new chairman named Paul Volcker, who was determined to whip inflation. The announcer had said something about interest rates, that they were going to have to go up. Sharply. Most farmers probably hadn't paid it any mind, too busy with the boom, too busy listening to the roar of their new tractors. But Tom had listened. And as he stood there in the dark, watching the distant lights of Rich's progress, the low rumble of that engine no longer sounded like success. It sounded like a drumbeat, growing louder and closer, a warning of a storm gathering just over the horizon, a storm that most people couldn't even see. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the game was about to change. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't a thundercloud, but a voice on the radio in Tom's machine shed. It was January of 1980. Tom was grinding the valves on the head of his Farmall M's four-cylinder engine, the methodical work a perfect antidote to the winter cold. The news came on, and the announcer's voice was grim. President Carter was embargoing grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Tom put down his valve-lapping tool, the gritty compound still on his fingertips, and listened. He didn't know much about geopolitics, but he knew what that meant. His biggest customer had just been cut off. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of the boom, would fall. And it would fall hard. That spring, a new tension hung over the county, as thick and damp as the morning fog. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous, brittle optimism. At the co-op, the talk was no longer about buying new land, but about locking in a decent price for the crop they hadn't even planted yet. The price of diesel fuel was climbing, another nail in the coffin. Tom saw Rich Peterson there one morning, arguing with the manager about the terms of his spring fertilizer bill. Rich's voice was louder than it needed to be, a sharp, defensive edge to it. He looked tired. There were new lines etched around his eyes, and his easy grin was nowhere to be seen. The real turning point came in the middle of a brutally hot July. A dry spell had settled over the Midwest, the corn leaves curling up during the day in a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. Tom was cultivating his soybeans for the second time, sitting on the open station of his 40-20, the heat radiating off the engine cowl in shimmering waves. He was watching his rows, keeping the cultivator shovels from getting too close to the young plants, when he saw it. Over on Rich's side of the fence line, the massive John Deere 4840 was sitting dead in the middle of the field. It sat there for the rest of the day. The next morning, a service truck from the John Deere dealership was parked beside it. Tom saw two mechanics in green shirts working on it, their heads disappearing into the tractor's engine compartment. They were there all day. Late in the afternoon, as Tom was heading in, he saw Rich drive out to the field in his pickup. There was an argument. Tom was too far away to hear the words, but he could see the gestures. Rich's arms flailing, the mechanic shaking his head and pointing at the tractor. Finally, the service truck drove away, leaving the 4840 sitting right where it was, a silent green monument to modern frustration. A few days later, Tom ran into one of the mechanics at the parts counter in town. The man was young, and he liked to talk. "See you were working on Peterson's 4840, Tom said, keeping his voice casual. The mechanic rolled his eyes. "Working on it is an understatement. The quad-range transmission is shot. Something about a clutch pack failure that sent metal through the whole system. It's a complete teardown and rebuild. We told him it'd be $15,000, parts and labor." Tom whistled softly. That was more than he'd paid for his entire farm in the early 60s. "Yeah," the mechanic continued, lowering his voice. "And the thing is, he wanted us to put it on his account. Boss had to make the call. Said the bank sent a letter to all the suppliers. Peterson's line of credit is frozen. Cash only. He just about lost his mind. Told us to pack up our tools and get off his property." So the 4840 sat in the field, a wounded giant, through the rest of the summer. Rich tried to get by with his older 1066, but it wasn't big enough to pull the massive chisel plow he'd bought for the new tractor, and it was constantly breaking down under the strain of trying to do the work of a bigger machine. The weeds started to take over the fields he couldn't cultivate. For the first time, Tom's fields, meticulously cared for with his old, smaller equipment, looked cleaner and healthier than Rich Peterson's. That fall, the whispers at the diner changed again. The pity for Tom was gone, replaced by a morbid curiosity about Rich. The price of corn had collapsed, just as Tom feared. Land values, which had seemed like a line that could only go up, had stalled. They hadn't fallen yet, but they had stopped climbing, and that was enough to terrify the banks. The interest rates, the ones Rich had bragged about being practically free money at 7%, were a thing of the past. The prime rate was climbing past 15, then 18, then 20%. Rich's operating loans were variable rate. The letters from the bank were no longer friendly reminders. They were stark demands, the numbers in the interest due column growing at a terrifying, cancerous rate. Rich's harvest was a disaster. His big new 7700 combine, with its complex web of electronic sensors and hydraulic controls, developed a phantom electrical problem. It would run for an hour, then shut down for no reason. The dealership sent a technician out 3 times, replacing expensive circuit boards and sensors, each visit adding thousands to a bill Rich couldn't pay. He was trying to harvest 1,000 acres with a machine that was as reliable as a lottery ticket. Tom, meanwhile, chugged along with his old Gleaner E. It was slow. He had to stop every morning and spend an hour with the grease gun, hitting every zerk. A bearing went out on the main cylinder, and he spent a whole afternoon in the field replacing it himself with a spare he kept in his toolbox. It cost him $12. He finished his 320 acres a week before Rich had even gotten through half of his. As Tom hauled his last load to the elevator, he saw Rich's combine sitting broken down at the edge of a field, half-harvested rows of soybeans stretching out behind it, a testament to a dream that was dying on the vine. The first snow of winter fell before Rich Peterson got his crop out of the field. The winter of 1981 was the quietest Tom could remember. It was a cold, grim silence. The usual post-harvest optimism was gone. There were no farmers in the dealerships pricing new equipment. There were no new pickups in driveways. There were just foreclosure notices in the county paper, small print listings of names and parcels of land, families Tom had known his whole life. Each notice was a death certificate for a multi-generational farm. The bank that had been Rich Peterson's partner in prosperity became his executioner. With commodity prices in the basement and interest rates in the stratosphere, his cash flow had vanished. The value of his land, his only collateral, was now plummeting as the market was flooded with distress sales. He was trapped. The massive, beautiful machinery he had bought was now an anchor, dragging him down into an ocean of debt he could never hope to repay. One bitter March morning, Tom was driving into town for a bag of feed when he saw the sign. It was hammered into the frozen ground at the end of Rich Peterson's lane. A big, professionally printed sign with the stark, cold words, "Farm auction. Land, machinery, household goods. By order of Henderson County Savings and Loan." The day of the auction was grey and cold, a biting wind whipping across the barren fields. The mood was the exact opposite of that day in 1976. There was no excitement, no smell of opportunity. The crowd was quiet, their faces grim. They were neighbors and friends, there to watch the dismemberment of a man's life, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. The auctioneer's chant, usually a sound of commerce and possibility, sounded like a funeral dirge. Rich's magnificent fleet of equipment was lined up in the yard, the paint still shiny, the tires still deep with tread. But it wasn't a display of power anymore. It was a row of tombstones. Tom watched as the John Deere 4840, its transmission still broken, was sold for scrap value. The International 3588, which had cost Rich over $70,000 just a few years before, sold for $20. The Gleaner combine, the grain system, the planters, the plows, it all went for pennies on the dollar, the proceeds barely making a dent in the mountain of debt Rich owed. Tom didn't bid on any of it. He had no need for it. He stood at the back, just as he had before, watching. He saw Rich standing near the house, his shoulders slumped, his face a pale, hollow mask. He looked 10 years older. His wife stood beside him, weeping silently into a handkerchief. They were losing everything. The house, the land his great-grandfather had homesteaded, all of it. Finally, the auctioneer moved on to the land itself. It was sold in parcels. The 160 acres Rich had bought in '78. The 80 acres from the old Johnson place. Each parcel sold for less than half of what Rich had paid for it. The bank representative stood beside the auctioneer, a man in a suit and tie, his face impassive as he jotted down the losing numbers in a ledger. Then came the last parcel, the original 240-acre Peterson home farm. The land with the house and the barns, the heart of the entire operation. "All right, folks, here it is," the auctioneer called out, his voice trying to inject some energy into the somber crowd. "The Peterson home place, 240 acres of the finest black dirt in the county. Who'll start the bidding at $500 an acre?" Silence. 500 an acre was a steal, a joke compared to the 3,000 it would have been valued at just 2 years prior. But no one had that kind of cash. The farmers who were still solvent were holding on to every penny, terrified they'd be next. The only likely bidders were outside investors or the insurance companies, vultures picking the bones clean. 500! Do I hear 500? The auctioneer pleaded. Tom felt a knot in his stomach. He looked at Rich, who had his eyes closed, as if he couldn't bear to watch this final indignity. He thought of his own farm, of the generations of millers who had worked that soil. This wasn't just dirt and buildings, it was a man's history, his identity. Before he even knew he was going to do it, Tom's hand went up. 500, he said, his voice clear and steady in the cold air. A murmur went through the crowd, all heads turned to look at him. The man in the suit from the bank raised an eyebrow. Rich's eyes snapped open, and he stared at Tom, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "I've got 500 from Tom Miller," the auctioneer said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Do I hear 550? 550? An out-of-town lawyer, likely representing an insurance company, raised a finger. 550. I have 550. Who'll give 600? 600, Tom said immediately, his voice stronger this time. The lawyer conferred with his client on a newfangled cellular phone, a brick-sized monstrosity. He nodded. 650. 700, Tom said, without hesitation. He had done the math in his head 100 times over the past few weeks. He knew exactly what was in his savings account. He knew what he could afford. The crowd was completely silent now, watching the two men go back and forth. It wasn't just a bidding war, it was a battle for the soul of the community, the faceless outsider versus the quiet neighbor. The price climbed. 800, 850, 900. The lawyer was getting agitated, his phone calls becoming more frequent. Tom remained calm, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. He bid in a calm, even voice, each time. 950, the lawyer said, a final, frustrated offer. The auctioneer looked at Tom. 1,000? $1,000 an acre, Tom. This was it. This was the top of his number. Every penny he had saved. He took a deep breath. He looked past the auctioneer, at the old farmhouse, at the hip-roofed barn so similar to his own. He looked at Rich, who was watching him with a desperate, pleading hope in his eyes. 1,000, Tom said. The lawyer threw his hands up in disgust and shook his head at the auctioneer. $1,000 an acre. Going once, going twice. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel cracked through the silence. To Tom Miller, for $1,000 an acre. A wave of relief seemed to wash over the crowd. A few of the older farmers came over and clapped Tom on the back, their faces filled with a respect he had never seen from them before. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt a quiet, profound sense of rightness. He had done what needed to be done. He found the man from the bank and wrote the check, draining his savings account to the last dollar. As he was folding the receipt, Rich Peterson approached him. He looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. "Tom," he said, his voice cracking. "Why?" "It's good land, Rich," Tom said simply. "Shouldn't be owned by an insurance company in Des Moines." Rich shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I don't understand. After everything, all the things I said to you, I called you a fool. I laughed at you." "The times made a fool of a lot of men," Tom said, his voice gentle. "It wasn't just you." He looked Rich in the eye. "Listen to me. You and your family can stay in the house. You can stay as long as you need to figure things out. No rent." Rich stared at him, speechless. "And," Tom continued, "I'm going to have over 500 acres to farm now. That's too much for one man. I'll need a hired hand come spring. Someone who knows the ground. The pay won't be great, but it's a start. Rich Peterson, the man who had once been the king of Henderson County, the visionary of modern agriculture, broke down completely. He covered his face with his hands and sobbed, deep, ragged breaths of a man who had been given a lifeline when he was expecting a final blow. Tom just stood there, putting a steady hand on his neighbor's shoulder until the storm of grief had passed. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly receded, and a new, more cautious equilibrium settled over the heartland. Tom Miller was no longer the county curiosity. He was a legend, the man who saw the storm coming, the man who survived because he wasn't afraid to be called cheap. Farmers who were struggling to keep their old equipment running would show up at his machine shed. He never turned anyone away, helping them fabricate a part or diagnose an engine problem, never asking for a dime in return. Rich Peterson worked for Tom for 5 years. It was a humbling experience, but it saved him. He learned the value of a paid-for tractor. He learned the quiet satisfaction of rebuilding a water pump instead of just replacing it. He learned the difference between debt and wealth. Eventually, he and his wife got back on their feet. He took a job managing the local co-op, and everyone agreed there had never been a better man for the job. He understood both sides of the ledger now, the seduction of the boom and the brutal reality of the bust. He and Tom remained friends for the rest of their lives, a friendship forged not in prosperity, but in the ashes of it. Tom never got rich. He never bought a brand new tractor with air conditioning and a radio. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his fingernails never truly clean. But he was wealthy in a way that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. He owned his land free and clear. He watched his children grow up and go to college, their education paid for in cash. He saw his son, David, come back to the farm, eager to learn the old ways. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Tom stood with David in the machine shed. Tom was older now, his hair grey, his movement slower but still deliberate. He was looking at the old John Deere 4020. Its green paint was almost completely gone in places, worn down to the primer and the bare metal by decades of work and weather. "You know," Tom said, running a hand over the dented fender, "back in the 70s, everyone told me this tractor was junk. They said I was a fool for keeping it, for spending my weekends fixing it instead of spending a banker's money on a new one." David, who had grown up hearing the stories, just nodded and listened. "They measured success by the size of your loan, by the shine on your paint," Tom continued, his voice quiet and reflective. "They forgot what farming really is. It's not about owning the most acres or the biggest machines. It's about this." He patted the tractor's iron flank. It's about knowing your iron, inside and out. It's about owing nothing to anyone but the dirt. It's about surviving the bad years, so you can enjoy the good ones. He looked at his son, the future of the farm, and saw that the lesson had taken hold. Never let a man in a suit convince you that a signature on a loan document is the same as money in your pocket. The only thing you truly own is the thing you don't have to make payments on. He climbed up into the familiar cracked seat, the same one he'd sat in for over 30 years. He turned the key, and the old 6-cylinder diesel roared to life, its rumble the steady, reassuring heartbeat of the Miller farm. It was the sound of survival, the sound of wisdom, the sound of a legacy earned not with borrowed money, but with a clear eye, a steady hand, and the stubborn conviction that being called cheap was a small price to pay for being free.